The year is 2011. The greatest find in modern biblical history has just been discovered. A manuscript containing texts from the Gospel of Mark, dating to the same century as Jesus' life, was discovered inside of a papier-mâché mummy mask. If the dating of it proved correct, this would be the oldest piece of any gospel ever found. So excited were its curators that they couldn't wait to announce it in the most professional, peer-reviewed academic journal imaginable: Twitter. This was, after all, the holy grail of biblical scholarship, a piece of the Gospels from the 1st century CE, given that the next oldest known fragment still in existence dates to significantly later in the 2nd century. The hype was so high that even extremely well-respected Bible scholars like Dr. Daniel Wallace couldn't help but prematurely tote this discovery in the middle of a scholarly debate to prove the unchanging reliability of the New Testament.
The oldest manuscript of the New Testament is now a fragment from Mark's Gospel that is from the 1st century. How accurate is the dating? Well, my source is a papyrologist who worked on this manuscript, a man whose reputation is unimpeachable. Many consider him to be the best papyrologist on the planet. His reputation is on the line with this dating, and he knows it, but he is certain that this manuscript was from the 1st century.
Checkmate atheists. News publications left and right ran with the story. Christians finally had the best proof ever for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Or did they? Well, no one would say exactly how large the fragment was. Was it a verse, an entire chapter, a full gospel? Who knew? In fact, the owners of the manuscript wouldn't even reveal how they knew it was definitively 1st century, or where it was located, or whether any other experts had had the chance to examine it and corroborate the date. But surely all of that would soon change.
Many months later. Much later. One eternity later.
Another year went by. Still no publication. Apparently the text had been sold off to the Green family, better known as the owners of Hobby Lobby, the same family who got in trouble for purchasing thousands of illegally smuggled artifacts from Egypt and Iraq, and who also fell for forged versions of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's another story. Several more years went by. Still no publication. And yet this entire time, every time a curious person like myself would Google for the oldest known gospel manuscript, honestly trying to figure out just how historically reliable the New Testament was, we would get page after page touting this allegedly 1st century copy of Mark, albeit unpublished and unavailable for any kind of scrutiny. Scott Carroll, the former curator for the Green Collection, continued to boast about this manuscript, which remained behind lock and key. As late as 2016, 5 years after the announcement of this still unpublished manuscript, Scott Carroll continued to weaponize it, slamming skeptical scholars since, after all, he had in his possession a gospel manuscript dating to the same century as Jesus.
Now, this is my opinion, the oldest ever discovered. Yeah, textbooks will change with this discovery. And when this hits the media, you will hear about it. Yes, you will. It'll be on every program.
But in 2017, when the Museum of the Bible opened, notoriously missing from the Green Collection was the 1st century Mark manuscript. It wasn't until the following year, after almost 7 years of hype since the initial tweet announcement, that the results were finally published. And the papyrus contained nothing more than tiny, partial fragments of just 4 verses. And they didn't date to the 1st century, but to the late 2nd or early 3rd. It didn't come from inside a mummy mask either, but had been taken from the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus collection at Oxford's Sackler Library. But even without a 1st century New Testament manuscript, were Christians really back at square one? Did they really need a 1st century gospel to prove the historicity of Jesus and the reliability of scripture? Well, not according to Gary Habermas or Daniel Wallace, 2 of the top Bible scholars in the world.
There's an incredible amount of evidence for Christianity. I mean, we have more evidence than we need. We frankly do.
New Testament scholars are confronted with an embarrassment of riches.
The same kind of history that tells you that George Washington was the first president of the United States is the same history that says Jesus was raised from the dead.
Now, Habermas isn't saying that we have more evidence for Jesus than for Washington. That would be preposterous. Although some Christians might make that inference, but what he's really arguing is that the same method used to prove Washington or any historical figure is used to prove the existence of Jesus. And that's true, But the language is a little deceptive. Here's how. Just because we have the same methods and standards when it comes to proving historical figures doesn't mean that the caliber of evidence for them is the same. When proving the existence of any historical figure, not all evidence is created equal, but you don't necessarily have to have the best possible evidence to simply conclude that someone probably existed. In history, it's not as crucial or often even possible to have the same level of certainty as, say, with rocket science. But in the case of George Washington, we do have that level of certainty. We actually have his tomb containing his body. We have his home containing the library he curated filled with books that he had marked with his book plate indicating his ownership. We have his sword, his pistols, his clothes, the harpsichord he gifted his wife Martha, his furniture, which included the bed that he died in, which has been a pilgrimage site for Americans pretty much since the day that he passed away. We have his wine coolers, dishes, glasses, punch bowl, candlesticks, and china with his wife's initial on them, letters written to him by other people, like the time that Lafayette sent him a picture of the Bastille in France the day after he ordered its demolition, and gave Washington the key to it. We have his and his wife's legal wills, his wife's diaries, paintings of him, and busts of his actual face that were made directly of him during his lifetime, so we actually know exactly what George Washington looked like. We have a lock of his hair, and thousands of letters and correspondences in his handwriting and writing style with his signature. We even have his great-grandfather's home in England, the Solgrave Manor, with his family coat of arms above the door. If that's not enough, there are over 10,000 objects just in the Mount Vernon collection alone relating to Washington, and that's just one collection. But I haven't even mentioned all of the things that people wrote about him during his lifetime that were written by people who knew him personally, or all of the official government documents that were drafted and signed by him as president. And we have originals for a lot of this stuff. This is what it looks like to have
More evidence than we need.
or to have an
Embarrassment
of historical riches. So how does Jesus stack up to that? After all, Washington was only a president. Jesus was supposed to be God. So the evidence should be pretty overwhelming. Let's start with the best evidence that we could possibly hope for and work our way down. Do we have a body? No, but if he rose from the dead, we wouldn't expect to have one, so that's not really fair. Do we know where his tomb or crucifixion site was? Believe it or not, while there are traditional sites established hundreds of years after his death, the honest answer to this is also no. There's a lot of speculation, but we just don't know. Do we have anything he personally built, wrote, or created, like a home, palace, temple, inscription, or any documents written firsthand by Jesus, even if it's a copy of something that he himself wrote? No, we don't. Do we have any contemporary artifacts depicting him, like coins, statues, paintings, or anything that would have been created by an eyewitness who knew or saw him firsthand? And paintings of white Jesus from hundreds of years later don't count. Now, while you might be tempted to point to the Shroud of Turin, that's unfortunately been debunked by scientists multiple times. The cloth was carbon dated to no earlier than the 13th century, over 1,200 years after Jesus' death. And forensic analysis of the blood patterns don't match crucifixion wounds. Do we at least have contemporary first-hand accounts written during his lifetime by eyewitnesses? Now, if you'd asked me this when I was a Christian, I probably would have pointed you to the Gospels and said that they were written by his disciples. But let's take a closer look. Luke wasn't a disciple of Jesus, and even straight up says that he's getting his information at least secondhand. In fact, forget the skeptic scholars, almost no prominent Christian Bible scholar today still thinks that the Gospels were actually written by Jesus' disciples.
Modern scholars believe all four of these Gospels were anonymously published. They don't tell us who their author is. The earliest manuscripts of these Gospels, we believe, did not contain the titles Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John. They just published the text as it was. If it ever did have an author's name attached to it, we don't have any evidence in the manuscript history, nor do we have any evidence in any other historical place. These names got attached to these documents, and that's eventually how they got included into the canon. People thought that these documents eventually were written by the people whose names that they possess, and therefore they thought they had some kind of connection to the apostles.
Matthew and Luke both pull a significant amount of their content directly from Mark, in many instances verbatim copying. So we know that they're not eyewitnesses, but instead are copying work from other sources. And John isn't written until later. And all of these texts are translations of things that Jesus might have said, because Jesus would have spoken Aramaic and the New Testament was written in Greek. But don't we have 500 witnesses who saw Jesus rise from the dead? Again, no. One account probably a second or third hand account, saying that 500 people saw him is not the same as having 500 different accounts. What about Paul? Well, the works of Paul are the oldest in the New Testament, and based on textual analysis, were probably originally written about 25 years after Jesus' death. That's pretty good. Paul doesn't give a detailed account of the life or teachings of Jesus, but he talks about him as a real person, a teacher with disciples who was killed and rose from the dead. But he also says in Galatians 1 that he didn't learn the teachings of Jesus firsthand, and he didn't get it from any of the disciples either, but instead got all of his information through divine revelation. But even if Paul or the authors of the Gospels had seen Jesus firsthand, we know that eyewitness testimony is terrible. Our eyes are not photographic, we remember patterns, we misremember things, our memories can change over time and even develop false memories. The Innocence Project has gotten numerous people off of death row using DNA evidence who were convicted by mistake because of eyewitnesses who got it wrong. Word of mouth too is a terrible transmission method. People exaggerate, alter stories, deliberately lie, change details to make the story more interesting or more convincing, especially if they're trying to not look foolish or trying to convert you. And for the first several decades, that's exactly how the stories of the gospel were spread, from the original eyewitnesses of whatever actually happened to a decades-long game of telephone among largely illiterate religious fanatics. I could not think of a worse way to transmit such an important message if I tried. By the time you get from the first witness to the writing of the original copies, we don't know how much had changed or been fabricated, and we don't even have these original written copies. In other words, we don't even know if what was written down originally in the first century is the same as the copies that we have now. You see, you know how I said that Paul's letters were probably written around 55 CE, Mark around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 85 CE, and John around 90 CE? Well, we don't have any of those original texts. The oldest texts we have are from the 2nd century CE, over 100 years after Jesus died. And the tiny handful of texts that we have from that century aren't complete texts. They're minuscule fragments. We have an almost complete version of John in the 3rd century, and the first complete version of Mark dates to the middle of the 4th century, over 300 years after Jesus' death. Even still, without the originals, there are multiple accounts written about Jesus and an entire cult following that we know sprung up around this figure. Sure, the Gospels and letters of Paul are biased religious accounts, but they are still multiple sources writing around this time period about a specific teacher named Jesus who had disciples who they claimed lived in Israel and was executed. In terms of ancient history, that actually seems really good. Not George Washington level good by any stretch, but especially when compared to other famous historical figures from this time period who we don't have any text about until several hundred years after their life, or who we may only have 1 or 2 accounts for. And in the case of Jesus, we also have some secular accounts mentioning him that were probably originally written within about 100 years of Jesus' life, like the Annals of Tacitus, Mara's letter to Serapion, a brief mention by Pliny the Younger, and of course 2 mentions by the Jewish historian Josephus, but at least one of those mentions is widely believed to be at least a partial forgery. I should point out that we don't have the originals of those either, and our earliest copies of those secular mentions come from centuries later. That said, if we're being objective and we apply the same historical methods to Jesus as we would to Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, Socrates, or any other figure, is it still safe to assume that he existed? Well, if an archaeologist finds a 2,500-year-old written account about a king who allegedly lived 2,700 years ago, unless there's some strong reason to doubt it, that single account is usually enough to tentatively accept them as a potential historical figure. For example, if you find a king's list with a genealogy naming successive kings, even if it's just the mention of a name, that's usually good enough. But if you have 2 accounts, then you're probably golden. Yes, there is more that goes into it, like source criticism, where you ask things like when and where was the text produced, who wrote it, what was their bias / credibility level, what's the genre of the text, and where did they pull their material from. But I would argue at this point that if we're simply asking if Jesus probably existed or not, then by most universally applied historical standards, I'd have to lean towards yes, because people existing isn't a far-fetched wild claim. In fact, billions of people do it every day, and larger-than-life cult figures spring up all the time. They attract massive followings and have religions form around them. Why should Jesus be any different? but the burden of proof for existence is a lot lower than the burden of proof for the virgin birth, miracle working, being a god, and rising from the dead. We have multiple accounts, for example, of Julius Caesar. He was probably a real dude. No historian really contests that. But we also have miraculous accounts of him becoming a god and ascending into heaven. In both the case of Jesus and Caesar, we can easily come up with sufficient motives that people might have to make these stories up about them. And in examining this, we can reasonably accept the first claim that Julius Caesar existed, but apply healthy skepticism to the preposterous one that he ascended into heaven as a god. If you're a Christian and you believe the miraculous accounts of Jesus, but not the ones of Julius Caesar, I have to ask why. Why the double standard? Is there an outsider's test of faith where you can ask, if I wasn't a Christian and I saw both of these accounts and I weighed them equally by the evidence, what would make one convincing that the other isn't doing? Because we know that gurus and prophets and faith healers con people left and right here, right now, in the 21st century. They use sleight of hand, the placebo effect, mass hysteria, and other forms of psychological manipulation, magic tricks, bold-faced lies, cold reading, and various forms of technology. They talk themselves up, take credit for things that they didn't do, and also rely on their followers to inflate stories about them through word of mouth. If you don't buy into Joseph Smith and L. Ron Hubbard and Muhammad and Jesus and Satya Sai Baba and all of the cult leaders past and present, but instead just choose one, why are you picking that one? Is it just because it's the one that you were taught to believe as a kid? Or is there a way that you can apply a test to your belief that all of the other belief systems can't pass? Now, I'm not telling you what to believe, but I would like for everyone to have consistency and intellectual integrity. Why is one charismatic leader right, chosen, divine, etc., and all of the others aren't? Now, there might be one that is the one true prophet or guru or God even. But if so, how can we know? They can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. And we should, at the very least, all be skeptical. I hope that this has given you something to think about, and I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, smash those like and subscribe buttons and share this with your friends. And if you see my work as valuable and you want to help me and my team keep doing this full time, please consider making a per video pledge on Patreon or a one-time PayPal donation. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.